Traders raised their bets on a second Trump presidency. Bloomberg Businessweek spoke exclusively with the Republican candidate at Mar-A-Lago. For more, let's bring in Bloomberg News Desk editor Jill Disis. So, Jill, a lot to unpack from this conversation. Let's start with his views on tariffs and China. President Trump making familiar noises from what he was saying back in 2016 about tariffs, trade wars, and whether or not the U.S. will come to the rescue of Taiwan. What are the takeaways here?
Yes, Paul, I think safe to say Trump is really just doubling down on a lot of those protectionist policies that we've come to expect from him. What we saw, particularly on the tariff front, were additional threats of even higher tariffs on China, in particular, new tariffs of upwards to 60%. He also, implied that there should be some kind of blanket tariff across all foreign goods of about 10%. So really doubling down again on that language about increasing those tariffs on trade, really becoming more protectionist. I think at this point it does seem like the Trump camp thinks that the fact that the Biden administration has actually kept a lot of the tariffs on Chinese goods in particular over the course of the Biden administration, that's really kind of validated a lot of what Trump was doing back in 2016 through 2020. So I think at this point it's pretty safe to say that Trump came out in this interview being very firm on this idea that there could be these increased tariffs here pretty much across the board, but obviously, as we've been discussing, very particularly on China.
Yeah, and let's talk about his remarks on Taiwan as well, suggesting maybe a major shift in U.S. policy coming if he wins.
Yes, certainly. I mean, obviously, there's been, incredibly important diplomatic relations between, the U.S. and Taiwan, particularly on the question of China, which, of course, China, says that Taiwan belongs to its own territory. What Trump actually said in this interview, he kind of came off as a bit, lukewarm on the idea of continuing to protect Taiwan, saying essentially that if there continue to be U.S. troops kind of, surrounding, protecting Taiwan, involved in a lot of these efforts, these military efforts in the South China Sea there, that Taiwan should ultimately compensate the U.S. in some way for that kind of protective action. He also had some comments there to, say about, the importance of bringing chip manufacturing and such back to the U.S. This, Paul, is kind of in line with actually what we've heard from Trump in the past on other allies of the United States, particularly NATO European countries. He's also said some stuff about, South Korea. The idea of stationing U.S. troops in Seoul and in South Korea is kind of a protection against aggression from North Korea, for example, saying again that the U.S. should be compensated for those actions. So I think at this point it does seem like economic grievances, at the very least, seem to be driving some of those thoughts on Taiwan there.
Yeah, it was a very broad-ranging conversation as well. Also, he had some remarks on deregulation, U.S. domestic oil production. What's the plan there?
Yes, I think, also maybe no surprise here to see Trump talk about this idea of ramping up domestic oil production, sort of, removing some regulations to make that happen. At this point, I mean, safe to say the Trump platform that we really gleaned from this interview is maybe not, entirely outside the wheelhouse of what you'd expect. It's lower taxes. He also talked about lowering the corporate tax rate even further from that landmark 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act under his administration. Now talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of 15% and increase, also, part of that is, increasing oil production, rolling out these additional tariffs. This is, all part of this, fairly comprehensive economic plan that Trump says he's putting together, although I'd caution you, Paul, that we were still fairly light on details as to how exactly this is supposed to impact things that, Trump says that he cares about, like the budget deficit and such. We'll have to see what that would ultimately look like should he, get a second term in office, if he does, upset Biden to win, which, as we've been discussing, based on a lot of the polling numbers and the recent action that we've seen just in the political landscape, does seem increasingly likely.